Imagine a world where the very ground beneath your feet was stained with the blood of battles that seemed to have no end. This was the reality of medieval Europe, a time when kings and emperors fought not just for power and land, but for the very soul of their people. In the heart of this chaos, two forces clashed: the Christian kingdoms of Europe and the rising Ottoman Empire. The year was 1396, and the stage was set for one of the most pivotal battles in history, the Battle of Nicopolis. For over 50 years, Europeans had heard the distant rumble of the Ottoman Turks, advancing like a storm from the east. These warriors were no ordinary invaders. They were the heirs of a long line of nomadic conquerors who had swept across Asia and into the heart of the Byzantine Empire. The Ottomans were a fierce and determined people, led by sultans who saw themselves as the chosen instruments of Allah, tasked with spreading Islam and purifying the earth of the filth of polytheism. This meant the Christian Trinity, and the Christian kingdoms of Europe were their primary targets. In the 14th century, the Ottoman Empire was led by Sultan Murad I, a man of relentless ambition and brutal efficiency. He had already captured key cities in Anatolia and established a foothold on the European side of the Bosporus. The fall of Gallipoli in 1353 was a turning point, giving the Turks a gateway into Europe. From there, they expanded their control, defeating the Serbs and Bulgarians, and pushing the Byzantine Empire to the brink of collapse. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, the 100 Years' War between England and France had been raging for decades. The war was a brutal affair, characterized by sieges, battles, and political intrigue. In 1396, King Richard II of England proposed a marriage to Isabel of France, a young princess who was only 7 years old at the time. The marriage was more than a union of two people. It was a political alliance meant to bring peace between the warring kingdoms. However, the proposal was met with resistance, particularly from the Duke of Gloucester, who saw it as a betrayal of England's interests. Despite the opposition, the marriage was eventually arranged, and a truce of 28 years was agreed upon. The truce was a significant achievement, but it was far from a guarantee of lasting peace. Many in England, especially those who stood to gain from the war, were not convinced. The Duke of Gloucester, in particular, remained a vocal opponent of the peace, believing that it would rob England of the gains promised by the Treaty of Bretigny. While the English and French were preoccupied with their own conflicts, the Ottoman threat loomed larger. In 1393, Sultan Bajazet, Murad's successor, captured the fortress of Nicopolis, a strategic stronghold on the Danube River. Nicopolis was not just a military asset. It was a symbol of the Ottoman advance into Europe. The capture of this fortress sent shockwaves through the Christian world, and the call to arms was heard across the continent. In response to the Ottoman threat, a coalition of Christian forces was assembled. The leaders of this coalition included King Sigismund of Hungary, who was determined to stop the Ottoman advance. Sigismund's army was a mix of knights, foot soldiers, and mercenaries from various European countries. They were united by a common goal: to defend Christendom from the infidel Turks. The journey to Nicopolis was long and arduous. The Christian army was a diverse group, with different languages, customs, and motivations. Some were driven by religious fervor, others by the desire for adventure, and still others by the promise of loot and glory. As they marched, the atmosphere was tense, with the weight of history and the gravity of their mission pressing down on them. When the Christian forces finally reached Nicopolis, they were met with a sight that filled them with both awe and dread. The Ottoman army was vast, with thousands of soldiers ready for battle. The Turks were well prepared, with a disciplined army and a leader who was known for his ruthlessness. Sultan Bajazet was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He had already proven himself a capable commander, and his army was a formidable force. The Battle of Nicopolis began on September 25, 1396, a day that would go down in history as one of the most significant defeats of the Christian world. The Christian forces, despite their numerical advantage, were poorly organized and lacked a coherent strategy. The Ottoman army, on the other hand, was a well-oiled machine, with each soldier knowing his role and following orders to the letter. The battle was fierce, with both sides fighting with a ferocity that left the ground soaked in blood. The Christian knights, clad in their heavy armor, charged at the Ottoman lines, only to be met by a hail of arrows and the flashing blades of the Turkish soldiers. The Christian foot soldiers, many of whom were peasants and farmers, were no match for the seasoned Ottoman troops. The battle raged for hours, with neither side willing to yield. As the day wore on, the tide of battle began to turn in favor of the Turks. The Christian forces, exhausted and demoralized, began to retreat. King Sigismund, realizing the futility of the fight, ordered a full withdrawal, but it was too late. The Ottoman cavalry, led by Bajazet himself, pursued the retreating Christians, cutting them down with relentless efficiency. The rout was complete, and the Christian army was decimated. The Battle of Nicopolis was a devastating blow to the Christian world. Thousands of soldiers were killed, and many more were taken prisoner. The leaders of the Christian forces, including King Sigismund, managed to escape, but the damage was done. The defeat at Nicopolis marked the end of the last major crusade of the Middle Ages, and left the Ottoman Empire stronger than ever. The aftermath of the battle was a time of mourning and reflection. The Christian kingdoms of Europe were forced to confront the reality of the Ottoman threat. The defeat at Nicopolis showed that the old ways of waging war were no longer effective against a well-organized and disciplined enemy. The Ottomans, on the other hand, were emboldened by their victory and continued their advance into Europe. The Battle of Nicopolis also had far-reaching consequences for the political landscape of Europe. The 100 Years' War between England and France, which had been temporarily halted by the truce, resumed with renewed vigor. The Duke of Gloucester, who had opposed the peace, saw the defeat as a vindication of his stance. The truce was seen as a failure, and the animosity between the two kingdoms only deepened. In the years that followed, the Ottoman Empire continued to expand, eventually capturing Constantinople in 1453, marking the end of the Byzantine Empire and the fall of the last remnant of the ancient Roman Empire. The Christian world was left to grapple with the new reality of a powerful Islamic state at its doorstep. The Battle of Nicopolis was more than just a military defeat. It was a turning point in the history of Europe. It marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new one, where the balance of power had shifted, and the Christian kingdoms were forced to adapt to a changing world. The lessons of Nicopolis were hard-learned, but they were essential for the survival of Christendom in the face of a formidable and relentless enemy. As the dust settled and the survivors of the battle returned home, they carried with them the memories of a day that changed the course of history. The Battle of Nicopolis was a reminder that the world was a dangerous place, and that the fight for survival was never easy. It was a story of bravery and sacrifice, of triumph and tragedy, and of the eternal struggle between faith and power.